Hello everyone, this is your revision video for component 2. Now I thought I'd do a much longer video here just to go over all of the aspects of component 2 that are important, but not only that, to make sure that I cover all of the exams that have come previously, to show you what the questions are like, and also to share with you how you should answer these questions. So let's go over a couple of things first. Keep in mind, please, that the paper will list the films that the questions are about before they ask the questions. Make sure you answer the right question for the right film. Now, this might seem incredibly straightforward and basic, but it is incredibly important. If you mistakenly answer a question that is intended for, say, Spirited Away as a Skyfall question, you will forfeit your marks on that paper. So please ensure that you answer the correct questions for the correct film. One question will always be shorter than the others. There will be a 5-mark question missing from one of the following questions. That means that you will probably have to write less on one film because you'll be missing a question, but that doesn't mean you should neglect it. Write as much as you can on the 15-mark answers. They require a huge depth of knowledge and will test your analysis skills. And in conjunction with that is bring in all aspects of your film study. Questions will have specific wants. They may want cinematography, they may want mise-en-scene, but other information that you've learned over the course of your GCSE can help influence that question focus. So maybe your question is on mise-en-scene. However, the context for some of that mise-en-scene is pertinent to the question. That means you should include it, okay? So just because it asks you about one specific thing doesn't mean you can't weave other aspects in as long as it links to the focus, all right? So moving on, I'm going to go through each of the papers since 2019 and show you what the questions were, and also how I would have tackled those questions. Now, there are no real predictions for what could come up. EDUQAS have repeated questions before. They have had the same question or similar questions 2 or 3 years in a row, and they have changed which question has the 5 marker and which doesn't. So there can't be any clear predictions about what will come up. There's no use really speculating either. But what I can do is try and prepare you for all eventualities and all different questions. So the June 2019, the Slumdog Millionaire question was, name a main character from your chosen film. So obviously it'd be Jamal Malik or someone similar. Briefly describe this character at the start of the film. Notice the bold. You would just describe what that character is like at the start of the film. Notice the 3 marks means you need 3 points about that character. Describe an important problem or conflict involving this character. Now, this is where I would start to bring in some key scenes, or where I would think of a scene that is important to this character in terms of its problem or conflict. So taking Jamal, for example, I might talk about the moment his mother is killed, and I would talk about the cinematography, the mise-en-scene, and so on surrounding that, that tells me something about why it was an important problem or conflict. It's 5 marks, which means you should write up to that amount. Don't necessarily treat it like a 5-mark answer in English where you would write 5 points. Sometimes you won't need to gather 5 points together as long as you've talked about the scene and you've used your technical codes appropriately. D, explore what happens to this character at the end of your chosen film. In your answer, you may consider if problems and conflicts have been resolved, how the character has changed, and ideas about narrative structure. Now, on the side here, I've got my acronym, which is SPAC, Scene Point Analysis Question. This is how I would answer a 15-mark question. What scene relates to the question? What point are you making with that scene? Analyze the scene using technical codes, and have you linked to it appropriately? The question, that is. So I would follow the bullet points. Have problems and conflicts been resolved in the film? How the character has changed, and ideas about narrative structure. Now, if I wanted to talk about narrative structure, I may want to bring in prop or Todorov's theory, most likely Todorov's if we're talking about structure. Now, you may mention that it doesn't necessarily link exclusively to Todorov's, because Todorov applies best to linear narrative, and as we know, it's a non-linear narrative in Slumdog Millionaire. So you may want to talk about that. How the character has changed. You may want to talk about how Jamal has changed from when he was a boy to when he's grown up, or just what we perceive of him at the start of the film to the end of the film. And problems and conflicts being resolved. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. So, of course, by the end of the film, he is with Latika and they've sort of connected and been with each other. So, you may want to talk about him and Latika. You may want to talk about him and Salim and how Salim unfortunately dies. And with his sort of like last wish or with his last breath, he makes sure Jamal is safe. So, does that excuse all of his horrible behavior over the course of the film? Those are the areas that I would consider when going for the 15 marker. But remember, it's like doing 3 5-mark questions. You need to write quite a chunky amount on this question. So ensure that you are analysing fully. That is where you'll pick up your AO2 marks. What does the camera, mise-en-scene, context, etc. tell you? How can you explore that using your technical codes? Okay. Now, moving on to global non-English language film. Spirited Away. The question was, identify a key location or setting in your chosen film. Now, location or setting has come up every single year pretty much. I'm probably going to contradict myself in a second, but I'm pretty sure it's come up every single year for a different film. If I had to guess, I'd estimate that they'd do another setting or key location question, but because they've done it at least 3 times now, it makes me think they may abandon that question type and move on to something different to keep it a little bit fresh. However, like I said, there is no way of truly predicting what is going on. So a key location or setting in your chosen film. Briefly describe the location or setting. Again, the same format as above. You briefly describe what that location or setting is. And then this one was missing the 5 marker in 2019. Explore how ethnicity or culture is represented in one key sequence from your chosen film. Notice the bold, ethnicity or culture. You don't have to do both, you can just do one. And it says represented in one key sequence. So you don't need to talk about more than one. You can, but they want to see depth. And in the mark scheme, they prefer you to stick to one just because you can explore that scene fully. However, if you are finding it a struggle to talk about just one scene, it's absolutely fine to talk about more than one, but they mainly want you to talk about one. And you may not get necessarily the highest marks if you talk about several different ones in a small amount of detail. If you talked about 2 in a huge amount of detail, fantastic, but then you need to consider your timing. In your answer, you may consider contexts, film form, themes, and issues. Now, this is an incredibly broad question because you're looking at culture or ethnicity. Now, I would be focusing in, if I was doing Spirited Away, on Japanese culture, and I would be talking about how it is represented in the film through a variety of different ways. So we talk about contexts, you might talk about the heavy industrialization of Japan, and you'll talk about how Chihiro's parents are a reflection of that. And you talk about sort of the consumerist attitudes and the Western influence on Japan and how that fuels her parents to literally becoming pigs. If I wanted to talk about film form, I may talk about how each cinematographical shot, so any shots, sort of linger on past cultural identity in Japan, and how you then may link that to context and think about how Miyazaki wanted to display the culture of Japan and show that the Japanese people still had their culture and they needed to cling on to it. And again, themes and issues I may talk about as well. Again, one of the themes of the film is ensuring that we look after the planet and make sure that we care for it. You may bring that up as part of the water spirit in the baths being cleaned by Chihiro, and how it's important and how it literally thanks her for looking after it. That probably would be where I went. Now on section C, on the Skyfall question was identify a camera angle used in your chosen film. Now, please stick to traditional camera angles. Don't try to do anything wacky. Stick to something like a close-up or a long shot or so on, and name it and make sure it's a correct camera angle. You can lose this 1 mark question if you name something that isn't considered a traditional camera angle. So if it's something a little bit out there, as long as it's well known, you can use it. Briefly describe how this camera angle is used in a scene from your chosen film. Interesting 4 marker. So it asks you for one specific scene, a bit like the 15 marker from earlier, but you obviously have to write less. Again, on the 1 markers and the 4 markers, stick to doing that many points. Briefly explore how cinematography creates meaning in a scene from your chosen film. Now, that is important. It's interesting they haven't bolded that. They're probably trying to catch you out a little bit here. Now, cinematography and how it creates meaning. So what does the camera tell you? and how does it display something on screen, and how does it make you want to feel. So if I did the cinematography at the beginning of Skyfall, I may talk about the long shot at the very end of the corridor and Bond stepping onto scene, and how the sound plays the sort of intro chime to Bond. That gives us a throwback to the traditional Bond style and the traditional Bond sort of films. I would then discuss that and talk about how it creates meaning and gives us a nostalgic look at Bond. D, explore how key elements of film form create a certain look or mood in your chosen film. You may consider key elements of film form. So you can literally talk about mise-en-scene, editing, cinematography in any way you want, aesthetics and visual style, lighting and colour. Now, I'd be focusing in on, for Skyfall, the ideas of blues and oranges and how it displays the issues surrounding spying. You know, you've got the idea of the futuristic spying with the blues and silvers in MI6, and then you've got the oranges and browns, which show the nitty-gritty of being a spy and the ground field work, and how that's sort of modern versus traditional. You may also talk about the idea that the film is Nolan-esque, because it has obviously influences on the look or mood of the film. And along with that, as I mentioned in the very, very opening of this PowerPoint, is you could then talk about how issues in society, you know, the context behind it influenced that visual style. The Dark Knight was spawned in an era of post 9/11 filmmaking, which became darker and grittier and more realistic. And Bond takes on board those ideas in this film. So that's what I would have done to answer the 2019 paper. Now, this is also used as their exemplar paper. So they put this out as their component 2 paper. For training and for mocks and so on. So I'm not sure how much you can take from this in terms of modern papers, because this was quite a few years ago now. In fact, it was 4 years ago that this paper was sat, and it was the very first one. So they were obviously just testing the barriers, but you can see what I would do on each of those questions. Okay, so let's look at 2020 and see how different it is. Again, like I said earlier, the first question here is describe a setting in the film you've studied. Now, again, setting has come up a lot. So you may see it again, you may not. Again, it's very difficult to make predictions, but because it's been in quite a few times now, you may not see it this time. Identify a setting in the film you studied, briefly describe the setting, briefly outline how a theme or issue is linked to that setting, and discuss how this theme or issue is presented in a key sequence. Now, I would probably go for the slums here if I was going to do Slumdog Millionaire. I would be describing the slums, the colour, the sort of environment it creates, the mood and atmosphere that comes from the slums. Briefly outline how a theme or issue is linked to the setting. I'd be talking about poverty, and I'd be thinking of being a slumdog, and I talk about the context that links to that, with Danny Boyle wanting to illuminate the idea of the slums. There are a lot of controversy surrounding the use of the word slumdog as well. And then D, discuss how the theme or issue is presented in a key sequence. I would talk about any sequence where it is held mostly in the slums and shows the sort of dilapidation of it and how sort of destroyed the place is. So thinking about that, you may go for when Jamal and Salim are witnessing the death of their mother. You may talk about when they're younger and they're sort of playing in an area they're not allowed to go in, and you've got that absolutely fantastic song that Danny Boyle was originally going to use as the opening. You could talk about the torture scenes right at the very beginning and how it flashes towards the studio to show the absolute massive difference between the two worlds, the binary opposition, if you will. But remember to stick to those bullet points and remember SPAC. Scene, point, analysis, question. What is the scene? What point are you making? What analysis can you bring? And have you answered the question? Okay. So going on to the Spirited Away question, identify and briefly describe one male character from the film you've studied. Now, for us in Spirited Away, this might throw some of you, because you might think, oh my goodness, the main character is Chihiro. Think, you've got Haku. You could potentially talk about No Face, but the character I would go for here, that's a very easy one to talk about, is Chihiro's dad. I describe what he looks like then in B. What does the costume tell us about the character? Well, he's got very Western influences. He's very much dressed like a Westerner. He's got, although it's not necessarily just his costume, you may talk about his sort of obesity, the gluttony that comes with that, and how he's got to sort of wear comfortable clothes to deal with that. And then in D, explore how gender is represented in the film you've studied, refer to at least one key sequence. So their bullet points are really helpful here. Male and female characters' appearance, actions, behaviors, elements of film form, and contexts. Now, because it's said about context, I would be bringing in Japanese culture and sort of the expectations of men and women in Japanese society. I would then try and link some cinematographical techniques to that. So at the beginning, I might talk about Chihiro's father and how he is incredibly tall. He's very large, and Chihiro is very much dwarfed next to him, especially when we have the point of view camera shots from her angle that show him to be quite massive in terms of her viewpoint, to show how important her dad is as a character. And her mother is quite slight and has the traditional female colours. The same as you may want to talk about Lin and Chihiro when they eventually are working in the bathhouse. They're wearing traditional female colours because they are being identified by society. They're being pushed into a box, whereas Chihiro wants to break free from that and be able to forge her own destiny. So that's how I would tackle those questions. For Skyfall, identify one visually interesting scene from the film you've studied. Now, obviously, this is incredibly subjective because you want to pick something that you think that was really interesting. Try and stick to the scenes that your teachers taught you, but I could go for Shanghai, which is an incredibly visually interesting scene. I could go for the very opening scene, which again is very interesting. I could go for Silver's Lair, which again is very interesting. Describe the look or mood created in the scene. So that's sort of what it looks like and how it makes you feel. What atmosphere does it have? It's a bit like a mood and atmosphere question in English. What's the vibe you get from it? And then again, they missed a 5 marker on Skyfall here. So this is the year that Skyfall was the shorter question. Explore how and why this look or mood has been created. Refer to at least one key sequence in your response. So I would probably, if I went for something like Silver's Lair, I could go for the sinister nature of the scene. So Silver walks slowly towards the camera behind Bond, and as it says there, cinematography is something you can talk about. We see an over-the-shoulder shot as he sort of creepily walks towards Bond, giving his monologue, and then when he arrives, we have a low-angled shot to show that Silver is sort of in control. However, Bond is also in an element of control because he is centralized and stable, even though he's being captured. And that would have been the filmmaker's intentions, the idea of creating a scene that shows Bond to be both captured but also in control. And it says there, meanings and emotions created. The scene itself, what emotions do you get from it? Do you get the fact that he's intimidating? Do you get the fact that Bond is able to control the situation and be quite smooth even though he is captured? Again, stick to SPAC, scene, point, analysis question. Okay. Moving on to 21. Slumdog Millionaire, name 2 characters who are different from each other in the film you studied. So you could go for binary opposites, Jamal and Salim. You could go for Jamal and Latika. You could go for Salim and Latika. I would stick to the main 3, but you could also bring in other characters like Maman and things like that if you wanted to, but their scope for talking about them might be a little bit limited. 3, how are these characters different? So that's a very easy question for Slumdog. Just talk about those characters and how they're very, very different. Briefly outline any character you sympathise with the film you've studied and explain why. That's quite a nice broad question. But because it's a 5 marker, I would try and link a scene to it, or at least part of a scene to it. So if it's Jamal, I might talk about the scene where he is thrown out by Salim, or when his mother dies. Again, I've mentioned his mother dying several times. That's an incredibly useful scene because there are not many questions they can ask you where that scene wouldn't be able to be used. How are key elements of film form used to introduce any 2 characters from the film you studied? Notice it says to introduce. Now, Slumdog has a bit of a trick way around this one. Characters are introduced several times in Slumdog because they grow up. Now, Jamal, although we're introduced to him at the very beginning, we are not introduced to him as a child until a little bit later. In the same way, we're not introduced to him as a teenager until a little bit later as well. So you can sort of mess around with that a little bit. You can talk about when characters are introduced, not necessarily when they're first introduced. So for this one, I would probably talk about Jamal and Latika, or you could talk about Jamal and Salim, but there may be very few things you can say that are different between the 2 of them. But Latika is a lovely one because you can talk about Latika's song that plays every time she ends up on the screen, the sort of use of camera in that scenario where she is looking up at the camera, meant to be looking up at Jamal, is that idea of adoration and affection. The colours that are associated with Latika are quite warm and powerful, and all that kind of stuff. So I would Stick to those two characters, Jamal and Latika, and talk about when they were introduced. And again, cherry pick the moment of introduction that you like, because those characters are introduced several times in several different age brackets. Okay, non-English language film, Spirited Away. Identify key setting or location. Once again, setting or location has come up 3 times in a row on 3 different films. Briefly describe the setting or location. Again, it's the same question. Briefly explore the link between this setting or location and a key theme or issue in the film you've studied. Lovely question for Spirited Away, because you can talk about sort of the rundown theme park if you want to, right at the very beginning, which shows the Japanese consumerism. You may talk about the rundown temple. You may talk about the bathhouse and how that situation is important and why it's important contextually for Japanese people. Explore how people and or places are represented in the film you've studied. That's a really lovely question because they've given you an and or. You can talk about both or you can talk about one. Gender, age, ethnicity, culture. This is exactly the same as the question from last year's, the year before's paper, where you could talk about gender, Japanese specific roles because of contexts, elements of film form like cinematography. How are people or places represented in that film? Okay, so you can explore Chihiro and how she's a representation of this. Once again, this is the specialist area for this film, which is representation. So the likelihood is a question could be related to representation because they do like to test you on the specialist area. So be aware of that. Elements of film form can display this representation. So thinking about how camera angles or color or costume or anything presents a character and how that shows us contextually what these people are like, okay? And finally, Skyfall, 1 key color, lovely. Again, they're missing a 5 mark on Skyfall, so they did it 2 years in a row, which, you know, it's completely random. This is what I said at the beginning. There's no way to predict what could come up. You can only try and plan for all eventualities. Briefly outline what the use of this colour typically suggests. So I'd probably go for orange, and I talk about Bond being the gritty spy who's still very old school and so on. Explore how lighting and or colour are used in the film you've studied. So really nice question because it's both lighting and colour. It's very specific though, so you need to stick to those 2 areas. And it tells you what to talk about when it comes to that lighting and colour, meanings and emotions, mood and look of the film, style and genre. Mood and look of the film is lovely because you can talk about the dark lighting, the low-key lighting, and how it links to the Nolan-esque dark cinema. Meanings and emotions, does the colour mean? What does it display? And also style and genre. How does it link to the genre, which again is spy and action? And does it link to the overall style they're trying to achieve with this new age Bond? And yes, they do. I might even chuck a little bit of cheeky context in there and talk about how Skyfall has evolved the Bond franchise and how before it was nowhere near this. Okay. Right. 22. This was last year's. What do you understand by the term plot? Now, this always throws people every year. So think about plot and story. Remember to use the revision materials I've given you on plot and story. We've done this quite a few times now. Think about the turning point in the plot of the film you've studied for 3 marks. So I would consider any moment in which there's a character is faced a challenge or something happens that changes their life dramatically. I would probably go for one of the questions. It could be the very ending question for Jamal. It could be the very starting question. It could be him being questioned in the police precinct. Discuss how elements of film form create meaning in 1 key plot point. Key plot point is incredibly subjective. You pick a moment that you think is an important plot point that modifies the rest of the film. So again, you're going to get sick and tired of me saying this, I would say the death of Jamal's mother is one of the most key plot points in the entire film. And again, it gives you massive freedom in the bullet points of what you can talk about. You are absolutely laughing if you get a question like this, because you can pick any moment in the plot that you think is significant. So pick your strongest scene and talk about it to death. In this kind of thing, where they give you everything, so where they talk about mise-en-scene, cinematography, and key plot points, I would almost do a paragraph on each if I could, but making sure that I explore it in depth as much as possible. Okay, Spirited Away. 1 adult character in your chosen film. Interesting. So adult characters for Spirited Away, as a variety you could choose from. I'd again go for Chihiro's dad. It's just a very easy one to go for. Appearance and behaviour, once again. How adult characters are represented in the film you've studied. there's a little bit of crossover here. So what you want to do is read the 4 marker before you read the 5 marker. The 4 marker here, just stick to what he looks like and what his behavior is. Do not mention things like consumerism and so on. Save that for the 5 marker, because adult characters are represented as consumerist. They're represented as they don't care. They can buy their way out of anything. They're arrogant. They don't really trust in culture anymore as much as they should. And explore how age is represented in 1 or 2 key sequences from the film you've studied. This is interesting. This is the first time they've said 1 or 2. That means that ideally, if they've given you the option, go for the majority, do 2. But again, then they shouldn't penalise you too much for doing 1 because they've specified it. So age, that means it doesn't have to be adult, as the first part of the question was. It is age in general. So younger characters, and talk about how they are presented through the cinematography and contexts. Okay, really nice question, and again, that was a really nice paper last year. So yeah, I'm very, very happy with that kind of question. And to be honest, you should be able to answer that just using those bullet points alone. So if I had to answer it, I may talk about Chihiro, and I would talk about how she starts off as this sort of non-binary character who is struggling to find her identity and doesn't really know where she wants to go in life, and how she modifies over time. I may also talk about No Face and how No Face is easily influenced and is meant to represent easily influenceable children, where he is using money because he sees other people using money. He feels he needs to get attention by giving people money. He is influenceable and he copies behavior much like children do. Okay, and on final question for Skyfall here, location or setting, 4 years in a row. They love location or setting because it's come up 4 times. I don't know, maybe they'll go for a 5th one and call it a year. But I honestly think that, to be honest, I do think we're going to see it again. I do think we're going to see a location question, so do look at that for all of your scenes. Briefly describe the mood or look of this location or setting. Great. So Silver's Lair, for example, you've got what we were talking about earlier. Briefly explore how the mood or look of the film makes you feel. So talk about it as a feeling. What does this make you feel and how does it do it? So I may mention some cinematographical techniques, mise-en-scene and so on, how it makes me feel. And then how far the film you studied has a distinct look or style throughout. Again, Nolan-esque. Departure from the usual Bond. The use of mirroring, the use of framing characters in the center of shots to show their stability, the use of color, all of those things will come into that question. That was an absolutely delightful question for Skyfall last year. I wonder if they'll be as nicer to you guys. So this is just the run over of all those question types, just to give you an idea of what you're working with. But if you look through all of these question types, they're very, very, very similar to each other. There hasn't really been a year where the questions have been that much different from each other. Maybe in 2019 they were a little bit different because they were trying the paper, but 4 years in a row having location and setting, there are elements here that you can really prepare for and think about. Okay, so hopefully that was useful to you, and I'm going to follow this up with a little bit of a revision PowerPoint of the revision that we did over Easter half term, and I'm hoping that that is going to be useful to you as well. So I'm going to stop sharing now and end the video. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you all very soon.